what spurred me to start writing the thing in the first place was that I discovered myself on stage turning into a monster. You know, I actually spat at some youth who was trying to scrabble up the front of the stage one day. And it was in the aftermath of that that I thought to myself, what am I doing? What's going on here? This doesn't feel right at all, you know. And that was really, that incident, which was in the Olympic Stadium in 1977 in Montreal, that incident really was the start, you know, was the catalyst for the start of writing the piece.
After I'd worked on Wish You Were Here and travelled with the show a bit, Roger then came to me with these tapes of the Wall, and we sat in this house here and listened to them. And he said at that point, I want to make an album, a road show, and then a film of the whole thing, and that was The Wall. And he described his idea of how a wall would be built across the stage to represent alienation between him, the performer, and the audience out there. In fact, alienation between all of us. It's all about barriers, the wall.
The second half of the show was just going to be a wall, you know. So we had to find ways that to make the second half of the show dramatic and also entertaining. My original idea was just to build a wall across the stage, and when it was finished, that was the end of the show. But then I decided that, well, maybe that was a bit too harsh, and that anyway, it would be a more interesting denouement if the thing was to be torn down at the end. And so we needed stuff to do on the outside of the wall, and animation seemed like a good thing to do.
It was quite extraordinary period, really, because what seemed to be, you know, fragmented ideas in the album actually were not that at all. It was very, very clear in Roger's head exactly what he wanted to say. And it was my job, actually, from the point of view of getting a screenplay, to make that cinematic.
The screenplay developed from conversations between Alan Parker and Jerry Scarfe and myself in Jerry's house in Cheyne Walk, where we would sit round and they would ask me, well, mainly Alan, I suppose, would ask me, you know, what's this fucking song about then? You know, and I'd say, well, I'm not really sure that. Well, and you know, and I'd dredge up kind of stuff from my past, or sometimes from other people's past, in that it's not entirely autobiographical.
Alan and Roger, between them, had written a script. It was more of a descriptive nature as to what images might fall against the songs. And it was very short. It was, I think, about 35 pages long. And so, because Alan was rather embarrassed that it was such a short script, he actually added about 10 pages which had notes, 4 notes, blank pages at the end of the script. So we had about a 50-page, 45 to 50-page script.
At the end of the day, you know, whatever we'd discussed that day, which is this section of the film, Roger would go away and type it out. And what Jerry would do once we'd left, he'd usually do like 1 or 2 images of what we'd discussed that day. And it gradually, during those days, it's built up into this very weird, surreal, kind of crazy storyboard.
When we first started the film with Alan, he had this idea of making a kind of storyboard of every frame in the film. He knew I couldn't do that, but he wanted me to do major parts of the film, and some of them I had already designed anyway for stage show and so on, and kind of evolved from that. So we worked in this room here in this house where the wall was covered with hundreds of images, which we would discuss and transpose and move around. And they were sometimes the briefest of little sketches, but they were my idea of what the scene should look like.
By and large, Pink's early life is autobiographical. When he starts trashing hotel rooms and things, that's something that I never got into. But quite a few people in my industry did. And there's a bit of Syd Barrett in there. The shaving of the body hair was part of his story. And then I guess the latest stuff, you know, where all the fascist stuff is possibilities for anyone who ever gets any power in any situation.
I think the film is about a burned out rock star, burned out from too many shows, too much booze, too many drugs, sitting there, disintegrating in a hotel room somewhere, thinking about his life. At the heart of that is all the pain of his marriage, of his father dying, his fears of madness, his fears of alienation, his fears of oppression, the personal walls that we build around ourselves, and the walls that are erected in society because of being alienated from one another. This culminates into a total and utter nightmare, which then explodes with the judgment of his life in order to tear down that wall, in order for us to have some semblance of life. I think that's what it's about. On the other hand, I think you better ask Roger, because he's truly the only one who does know.
Alan's contribution was great in that when he became involved, he was very clear that there shouldn't be any concert footage, that there shouldn't be any film of a band in the film. There shouldn't be anything to do with because my original attempts at writing a screenplay has developed a narrative around what was going on at a rock and roll show. And so when he got involved, we dumped all of that. I remember I'd written scenes at a certain point of an audience at a stadium gig being bombed, and as they were being blown to bits, sort of applauding wildly.
It was an incredibly difficult task to actually find somebody to play Roger, basically. And I think that the choices of casting for that lead role were fairly narrow. There were not too many people who could take on the acting side as well as having a half-decent rock and roll voice.
I met with Bob, and I wasn't sure if he ever could act. Nobody could, I mean, he was quite charismatic even in those days, and I think that the only way I could do it really was to do a screen test. And I did gave him a scene from Midnight Express, which is actually quite a difficult scene to do, which is a courtroom scene. And he did it really brilliantly. I mean, he did it in an Irish accent, which was rather odd, but it was really good. We were kind of astonished at what a good actor he was. We now know how good an actor he is, but that was really how it came about. It was actors first. I looked at actors in London and New York, and I ended up with Bob.
The choice of Bob was risky. On the other hand, Roger had a certain amount of input as to who he would allow to play himself anyway. Roger was also worried about Bob's voice, whether Bob would actually be able to sing the songs. And I believe at one time we thought about actually Bob just mouthing Roger's words. But in the end, I think Alan convinced Roger. It was really Alan who convinced Roger that Bob was the best choice for the movie, and that also that Bob should re-record the numbers that we wanted him to sing on in front of the camera.
There was only one time we had an argument, was when he was during Comfortably Numb, when he's turning into a pink blob. That was rather uncomfortable for him, actually, in the middle of the night in a biscuit factory in Hammersmith when it was very, very cold, and all he had to cover him up was a pink slime. I think that's the only time when he thought I was taking advantage of him. But otherwise, he took to it very easily. The young Pink was... I did casting sessions, open calls, saw thousands of kids here in London, in Manchester, in Leeds, in Glasgow. And, when you're looking for a kid like that, you just can't see enough of the kids, and then suddenly someone comes in who has some special quality, which I thought he had.
The lighting approach was always affected by the story, the mood of the scene, the way Alan wanted to play it. If it was a strong, stark situation, then I would go more bold with a backlight or a crosslight, but always the simplest approach. For a lot of the interiors, we'd be working at very low light levels, so the fast stock, fast lenses, plus the fact we were working with anamorphic, meant that I needed that fast film stock to get the quality out of those lenses. We were teetering on the edge very often.
The swimming pool scene is a classic example of, it was a beautiful drawing that Gerald Scarfe had done, which was just a sort of crucifix position of a man lying in a swimming pool. And I always remember Jerry Scarfe dipped his brush in red and just went like that and put a red blob on it, and suddenly it came alive and there was the blood. And I was trying to match that really, and cinematically that was very difficult because you can't. That's just one frame. So it's. I think I'd just seen Napoleon, Abel Gance's film, so I always wanted to use the pendulum. So we made a pendulum and we put the camera on the end of it.
The swinging pendulum effect was something of a surprise to me. Alan came up with it, as we were always having to invent as we went along. We'd been very busy on the interiors and we were succeeding well. And Alan one morning came up with this idea that we've got to move the camera over the pool. And I didn't know where his idea came from. He must have had a reference somewhere, perhaps. And so we ended up building this rig very quickly.
Many of the locations were depicted as to, the working class house, by the canal. We had to recreate an American stadium, so we went to Wembley, the football stadium, and did it at the back of the Wembley football stadium. We had to recreate the Second World War, and we went down to Barnstable, which had wonderful sand dunes, and we put up barrage balloons and tanks and a lot of explosions.
The tunnel scene where young Pink puts the bullet on the railway line, we were up against the wall. We were out in the countryside. We didn't have generators or lighting. We were miles from any tarmac road surface. So we decided to shoot stylistically and strongly with what we had. And you'll remember from the scene, we were inside the tunnel and we silhouetted young Pink against the exterior, which gave this bold, stylish impression with just the natural light.
Originally in the film, we were kind of experimenting with some elements that had gone with the stage show. We experimented with giant inflatables. For instance, at the end of that tunnel originally was going to be this giant inflatable of the teacher, and we had that on the end of a crane, and of course that didn't work. What happened was, at the end of it, anything that I'd actually taken from their stage show, we tried to put into the film to begin with, but everything theatrical didn't work. So everything that's in the film was of a more realistic nature.
In the show, it was mainly Jerry's animation of the teacher, and with him as a puppet, with the wife whacking him and him whacking the kid. But in the movie, all that stuff with the maze and with the mincing machine, well, there's also an animated version of the mincing machine in the show, with the teacher putting kids in the top and, winding the handle and getting worms out at the bottom. So Jerry designed a set and they built it with a maze and with the machine with kind of hammers and cogs and this kind of infernal machine, which I think he'd had that idea anyway for something else previously, and so had the chance to. He'd had the idea of the school as mincing machine before we even talked about the war, and so this gave him the opportunity to, to build it and have it filmed, and it is startling. It's quite startling. I love the conveyor belt with the desks on it.
When it came to something like a surreal set, the education sequence, for instance, I drew out very carefully in a series of drawings. I always felt that in my education I was being rammed through a maze, not knowing where I was going next or which direction I was in. I couldn't get an overall picture of it because I was down in it. Then there was a feeling of being shoved through a mincer and all these things. So all of these things fed themselves into a series of designs that I made. And it was quite frightening, really, because I remember that I did make these little tiny sketches, sometimes almost on the back of an envelope. And suddenly you'd look, and this thing would be a £100,000 set at Pinewood, this little scribble, and you think, oh, God, did I really mean that?
The set and the storyline in The Maze was saying everything, so I just used a very simple graphic light source and banked up a few Dinos, enormous banks of lights, in the studio gantry. Just gave the whole thing a single backlit source with a minimal amount of fill, and really let the image work for itself.
The school I went to had some decent teachers in it, some very good teachers, but by and large, they were the exceptions that proved the general rule that the school was kind of interested in maintaining order, and gaining university entrances. It was those days when a lot of grammar schools liked to pretend that they were really public schools, so we played rugby, not soccer, and and there was a CCF, and there was a lot of ruling by shame, really. There was a lot of quite nasty, sarcastic people at the school who try and control the boys by putting them down.
I remember the morning when we did the Nazi rally. I'd asked for, I think it was 380 skinheads, and they were real skinheads. So actually keeping them under control was actually quite difficult. Before we'd even started, the choreographer had to teach them this strange kind of, Nazi two-step that we wanted them to do.
We had enormous crowds, we had technical difficulties. The Royal Horticultural Hall doesn't have any of the normal facility for filming, but we liked the Speer-like architecture and what the art director could do to it. We had to build enormous rigs for our lighting and to black out all the daylight, so we had studio control. We rented enormous spotlights to reflect, in a way, the rock and roll concert, but meld that with this horrific Nazi rally situation. We also had great difficulty with the crowd at times. We had real skinheads. And there was one moment that was kind of humorous where I was taking light readings amongst all these heavy skinhead dudes in their black outfits. They were joking about throwing me over the balcony, which was semi-serious, but they often got involved too much with the scene.
It was kind of hairy, particularly when we did some of the more violent scenes with these skinheads, because in the end, to them, of course, it's not an illusion, which film is. They started to think that it was real, so it's kind of difficult to control them in some of the more excessive, uglier scenes that I've filmed. And you always wonder as a film director, that you might be crossing the line when you actually getting people to do things which are not very pleasant, but actually look like good shots. So you have to control yourself there. But I remember the day that we did the fascist rally. It kind of went off without a hitch. Well, not too many hitches. I think a few people had a few punch-ups, but no more than the average football match.
Roger and I had worked on the stage show and in a way had almost devised the film by the time we came to Alan. And Alan naturally wanted to do it his way, which is his job. If he was going to be directing the film, then he wanted to take over. And I felt at that point when he was taking over as though I was being slightly sidelined and didn't particularly like that.
It was really those instances between where the live action finished and the animation took over were, shall I say, not in terms of difficulty between the two, between Alan and Gerald, but just where they would come and where they would start and where they would finish in the movie, and how much of each sequence was necessary to create the feel that was needed for that particular sequence of events and that song.
All the animation was done by Gerald Scarfe, and Roger himself looking after all that. My job really was the cohesion of how the live action worked its way into the animation, and how you came out of the animation into the live action, so that fusion actually was seamless.
Now, the flower sequence, for instance, I think that just sort of sprang from my imagination one day. I remember making a series of very, very quick drawings about the flowers growing up and caressing one another, and then sort of almost turning into vaguely human forms to make love, to copulate suddenly, and then that's very violently over, and they're suddenly twisting around one another in a kind of anxiety, and then they attack one another, and then fly off like sort of, the female devours the male. There we go. And flies off into the distance. I attempted to do it in this very, very delicate style, which meant that each drawing, and there are 12 drawings per second in animation, had to be rendered very, very carefully in coloured crayon and coloured pencil. And I think each drawing took maybe 2 days to do, and there were thousands of them.
The flower sequences, for instance, you would have to, and I'm sure you have asked Jerry Scarf about that. I mean, when we were watching the movie together and doing a commentary for this DVD, and those sequences come up, I'm always joking with him and saying, "What's that, Jerry? What's that flower turning into?" And he goes, "Well, I haven't offended that, but, so that's Jerry." Now, in all that kind of very kind of sexual images that he draws, there are resonances, I suppose, for everybody, and certainly there are for me. So you could say that those are projections of the bit of Pink that is within Jerry Scarf.
Well, where the animation comes from is a tough question, really, because I'm not sure I've ever thought of that. Where does it come from? Does it come from Pink himself? Is it his point of view? Is it my point of view? Is it Roger's point of view? Is it the film's point of view? I think it's a bit of everything. But I suppose if I had to come down on one side, it would be that it is all happening in Pink's imagination. He's having a breakdown, as we know. And these images are, certainly the trial is sort of flashing through his mind. Goodbye Blue Skies, which I think in a way is my favourite sequence, which is about the last war, is a kind of reminiscent piece. And Pink at that time is a baby in the pram, so I'm not sure that he could be realising anything about the last war. They are my statements in the film, which complement, hopefully, the narrative and all that's happening elsewhere.
I especially liked the hotel room that Pink was ensconced, if you like. It was a kind of nucleus throughout the film. Initially, I lit that room with Pink fixated in front of his TV. I lit it really just by the TV and then boosted the lighting strongly because it took me towards that Gerald Scarfe look. It also had the feeling of trapping Pink in the light of the TV and isolating him from the whole world, and it had a lot to do with his own paranoia and his own self-conscious drugged state, if you like a butterfly trapped in this light.
The transitions of animation in the film had to be worked on in close association with Alan because he had to shoot the scene from which I would spring. Of course, we discussed what we were going to do, and there is one that comes to mind where the shadow of a figure appears on a wall behind. So Alan very carefully shot it so that this woman's silhouette was sharply defined on the wall behind her. I then took that frame of film and animated from that, and brought this huge kind of monstrous praying mantis figure out of the shadow.
The lighting in the hotel room when Pink was really going through his paranoid situation, there's a moment where his wife's shadow arrives on the wall. And I was really excited by that scene, knowing that Gerald was going to meld his animation into the live action. So we lit this enlarged, out-of-scale hotel room just with one large arc on the floor with a clear glass. And it gave us a wonderful sharp shadow of her figure, which walked apparently on the floor. And partway through that scene, Gerald takes the shadow into the animation. Lovely combination of traditional kind of work and this creative element that Gerald has.
The trial was the first sequence that I did, and when Roger came to me with that, he had more or less a strict set of lyrics that one had to illustrate. So I knew who the characters would be. I didn't know how they would look. There was this thought that the judge should be a worm, and at one point, in fact, he does turn into a worm. And then I, at the back of my mind, had this idea, I think it's Charles Dickens said the law is an ass or something, and so I made the law an arse, and it had this gigantic backside, which wore a wig and spoke out of its orifice and denounced everything, which seemed to me to kind of fit the image I wanted. So I chose lots of different images there. And Roger's always been extremely kind of open to, I think his philosophy is, if you invite an artist to do something, you can't quarrel with what they're doing. Well, that's what you employ them for.
When we got into the mixing theatre, it was amazing because for the first time, certainly on Pinewoods, and I had to actually get permission for James Guthrie to mix the movie because we were working under a union agreement within Pinewood Studios. So the two mixers mixed the effects and the film side of the mix, and James mixed. I think we had two 24-track machines mixed the actual music side of the movie.
We moved into Theatre 2 at Pinewood Studios specifically to remix the entire album to picture. Everything changes really when you're sitting down and watching visuals with the film. And also as the film was taking shape, songs needed to be shortened or lengthened. Bring the Boys Back Home, for instance, is twice the length that it is on the album. Run Like Hell gets shortened quite considerably. And also in order to make use of the film sound setup, being the film was originally released in Dolby 70mm, so you have stereo surround, subwoofers. It's more of a sort of grand experience.
We had set up a huge meter on that would hung from the top of the studio, from the ceiling, so that we could actually watch when we were going into the red, and blowing the sound system, and we were touching on red for most of the movie. It was a rather good mix for its time.
Mother, we re-recorded Mother in order to give it a more narrative style, and so that it was better film music.
So the song had to be much longer, and it also had to be able to start and stop and be more dynamic. And because there's a section, I think we go through the song and dynamically it changes, and then there's a section where we find the wife comes home and finds Pink sitting behind the piano composing a song, already at this point very withdrawn, and so the song, the music of Mother had to fade out at that point so she could deliver her dialogue. And then it comes back in with Roger just playing acoustic guitar and singing, and the song rebuilds.
I mean, one thing that comes up a lot in the movie is on the record you get a bit of the Battle of Britain, Simon, where are you? And all that stuff. And you hear it clearly. So we used that in the movie as well. I don't think there's any of the Dam Busters on the record.
You want me, Crosby?
So that must have come out of discussions with Alan and my kind of obsession with that movie and that bit of kind of English cinema.
The second half of the song, The Empty Spaces, originally was called What Shall We Do Now? And it was all one piece of music. It was on the original album, and we removed it from the original album, I think at the time, to just make the storytelling of the album a bit more concise. And so this was a great opportunity to reintroduce that, because it's a terrific piece of music, and it's the whole list that happens of What Shall We Do Now after The Empty Spaces.
When the Tigers Broke Free is important piece of the narrative. and I think was a song that I think it's a song that I had written earlier, which didn't find its way onto the album or into the original show on the grounds that it was too Roger Waters specific, because it is the story of my father's death.
When the Tigers broke free, originally we recorded that as one piece of music, as one song. It appears in the film in two pieces, so we basically mixed the first half, faded out, and then we go into another series of sections, and then it does a reprise after Brick One, I think it is.
In the movie, it became clear that part of the way to make the movie work was to be much more specific in terms of the autobiographical narrative. Consequently, that song could fit back in it again, so we recorded it with the Pont Adylis Male Voice Choir from Gorseinon near Cardiff, and that was wonderful working with them.
Hey You was in the film originally right towards the end, and we actually dubbed that reel. It was the original Reel 7. And one day Roger and Alan Parker sat down to watch the film together, and my understanding is they got to the end of the picture, and Alan said to Roger, "What do you think?" And Roger said, "I think it's pretty good, but we should cut out Reel 7.
I remember sitting and watching it all with Alan and thinking, God, this is too long, and it rambles here and this and that. And so I think it was my idea to dump Hey You. I just said, it's just too much, you know. I think we'll just lose everybody at this point, so why don't we just dump it?
As soon as they decided to remove that reel from the film, Jerry Hambling recut, I would say, about 90% of that footage, or 80 or 90% of that footage, he did a number of fast cut sort of collage montage scenes in Brick 3, for instance, and it happens again on the Tear Down the Wall section at the end. So most of what was there visually for Reel 7, you still see in the picture. All we lose, unfortunately, is the song, Hey You. It was interesting because the film was shown at the Cannes Film Festival that year that was finished. It wasn't actually running the competition, but it was shown at the festival at midnight one night. And Britannia Row, which was the Pink Floyd rental company at the time, took an entire PA system down to the theatre, set it up behind the screen in place of the normal cinema sound system, and played it at gig level. And the look on people's faces, it was classic.
When I finished the film, I didn't really want to watch it. Of course, I went to the premiere, and then after that, for 10 or 15 years, I didn't watch it. It was only quite recently when I went to see Roger in Paris, and we looked at the film together, that I looked at it. And it's strange looking at something you've done in the past. It's rather like going back through old diaries and seeing all the entries you've made. And in some cases thinking, what a bloody waste of time that was. And other times thinking, when you see an entry, well, that wasn't so bad. And it was very much the same feeling looking at the film. A lot of it, it's had some good things in it. And there are things I personally would have liked to do better. I've grown used to, when you work in a collaboration, it's a certain amount of give and take, and you have to not have things exactly the way you would like them.
Making the film eventually became a very unnerving and unpleasant experience, because we all fell out in a big way, you know. As Jerry says, he thinks it was people, Jerry and Alan and me, coming together. All of us used to, being big fish in our small ponds and getting our own way and doing our own thing and not really having to compromise or really collaborate with people very much. And there were serious clashes in terms of style and, philosophy, and so it became very difficult.
In the end, this film was it was a creative collaboration, quite wonderful in a creative way, and it had a lot of very different people together. From a personal point of view, it was no fun, as everybody knows, but it was at the heart of it. At the heart of it is Roger's primal scream. It's Roger's piece and it's Roger's madness, But you had a number of very creative people who actually contributed, therefore, to this overall film from a point of view of how it was made, in so much as it's not just the work of, of myself and Gerald Scarfe doing the animation. It's also, it's brilliantly photographed, I think, and also I think Jerry Hambling, the editor, should have an enormous amount of credit, because in the end he was the final backstop to Roger and me.
The contribution of the production side to the movie, I thought, was pretty damn good. I think that we actually achieved everything that Alan wanted at that time. We shot on Beckton Gas Works, which Mr. Kubrick shot much later on, and did Full Metal Jacket there. We had some interesting, unusual locations. I think we recreated the storyline as depicted in our 35-page script rather well.
In those days, we were really trying to do something that stood apart from other pictures. Film sound up until that point it was evolving, but it was not really that fantastic. Just at that time, I think Sensurround was coming in, and people were starting to take much more notice of the sound quality in a film. So we were really trying to do something that dynamically and musically was much bigger than a much bigger experience than people had had before in the cinema. In fact, for the first run of the film, when it opened, we went round to all the major first-run cinemas in a number of towns in London and Los Angeles particularly, and added subwoofers into the theatre sound system and did some tweaking, and in general tweaked the Dolby playback system so that it would be louder and more of a sort of Sensurround experience.
The movie is, from my perspective, deeply flawed because it doesn't have any laughs. And humour is a big part of my life, and it's a big part of the story as well. And somehow, and I'm not blaming anybody, particularly for this, but or any more than I blame myself. Somehow, none of that got into the film, and none of it got into the screen. It's a pretty dour 2 hours.
So of course I'm pleased that I was part of something like that, but it didn't obviously feel like that at the time. And I'm not sure what people get from it. A lot of fans come up to me and say, "Wow, how do you feel after The Wall?" And I say, well, it was just like a piece of work for me. It was a job, and I did my very best. But didn't it change your life? I said, no. What changed my life? Well, it changed mine, they say, So obviously it had some kind of message to people that I wasn't aware of at the time, which changed their lives, so they say.
I wrote a poem a few years ago that was it was actually about reading books. It's about that moment when you're reading a book that engrosses you and you're getting near the end and you don't want the thing to finish. So you start putting it down and you stop reading. Well, I do anyway. And I know this is a very common experience of people with books. And so I wrote this poem, the first verse of which goes, there is a magic in some books that sucks a man into connections with the spirits hard to touch that join him to his kind. And that, it goes on, a man will eke the reading out, guarded like a canteen in the desert heat, but sometimes needs must drink, and then the final drop falls sweet, the last page turns, the end. And the poem goes on, but the important bit is that sucks a man into connections with the spirits hard to touch that join him to his kind. I think all work that endures does that.
Looking back on the music 20 years on, I think everything stands up really well. The film is the music, really. I mean, it's a narrative, it's a visual representation of that story, of Roger's story, and great music is timeless.
It may be that now that what's interesting about the 90s and about the new millennium is that it may be that human beings are arriving at a point in their evolution where we're beginning to understand the way we work to a point where we may be able to break into the cycle, the cycle of disconnectedness that we pass on from one generation to another.
Looking back on the film, which we did 20 years or so ago, I'm left with a feeling of, well, I feel very happy that we did that film. We experimented a lot. There was a strong message within the whole thing, too. I always think very fondly of that project.
I have a feeling that we have it within our grasp to catch up with ourselves and to actually affect our evolution by using our brains and our hearts and our minds. And maybe that's what religion is, and maybe that's what art is. Maybe that's the point of it, you know. Maybe that's the point of this movie. Maybe that's the point of all art or writing or whatever. Maybe it's all part of the process of us, of the human beings trying to evolve to the point where we can kind of get a grip on this stuff and say, we no longer need to, you know, go and murder the chimpanzee next door.
I think that it was miles, years ahead of itself in what it was trying to achieve, because it, it was done long before, MTV had even opened their doors. And I think to try and make a film that, it's 99 minutes long, I think. It's, it's made up of 60 hours of filming. There's 6,000 something cuts in it. There were 10,000 drawings made on Gerald Scarfe's animation. Putting all that together, and at the heart of it, this incredible music, I think is as modern today as it was when it was made. In that regard, my small contribution to it, I'm quite proud of.
You know, the final scenes are completely introspective. I mean, the trial scene is, it's this internal dialogue going on within the central character. And at the end of the story, this is why I haven't done the piece for musical theatre yet, is because up until now, I haven't known how it ended, and I certainly didn't know, I had no idea how it ended 20 years ago, which is, I guess, why the ending is so enigmatic. Okay, tear down the wall, but then what? All alone or in twos, the ones who really love you walk up and down outside the wall, some hand in hand, some gather together in bands, the bleeding hearts and the artists make their stand. But when they've given you their all, some stagger and fall. After all, it's not easy banging your heart against some mad bugger's wall. Well, so it's a very kind of open-ended and... Yeah, I guess the end of the movie, really, and the end of the record is going... More or less what I'm saying to you here today is, I'm fucking confused, and yet I have a sense that I can make a difference.